Okay, so these are the devices that you need to be using in your writing piece over the next 3 lessons. You need to be using anecdotes, which might be short, amusing or interesting stories about a real incident or person to put your perspective into context. Using statistics, which is the science of collecting, analysing, presenting and interpreting data, so your kind of numerical facts. Presenting your opinions, which is your viewpoint or judgment formed about something. It's not necessarily based on fact or knowledge, it can be a feeling. Use imperatives, command words, do this, do that, go there, vote now. Rhetorical questions, questions that don't require an answer. Anaphora, which we'll talk about in more detail in a minute. Repetition of a word or expression at the beginning of successive phrases. Direct address, talking directly to an individual or group of people. And hyperbole, which is exaggeration. So today's big question is, what is rhetoric? Okay, so we are looking at the art of rhetoric today. So these are a selection of question 5s, and you will notice that they are all very similar. They have a statement. All sports should be fun, fair and open to everyone. These days sports seems to be more about money, corruption and winning at any cost. So you should, and then from that statement you're asked to write something in response. It may be a letter, it could be an article. Pay quite close attention to what you've been actually asked to write, and you're asked to put forward your point of view, not both sides of the argument, your opinion on the statement. So again, you see another example there. You've got a statement, write an article, argue your perspective. A statement, an article, explain your point of view. Okay, so often they are articles. If they're articles, they need a headline, potentially subheadings. It needs to be clear that they're from a newspaper. If it's a letter, it needs a dear sir or madam, or dear transport minister, dear Mrs. Murray. It needs to make sure that you're writing in the correct format. So another word for persuasion is rhetoric. Okay, so rhetoric is simply defined as possible, the art of persuasion. It is the art of getting people to do or think what you want. Rhetoric is the study and art of writing and speaking persuasively, but doing it well. Studying rhetoric teaches students to write in a way that ensures people stand up and take notice. Studying rhetoric teaches students to write arguments that are convincing and eloquent. Studying rhetoric teaches students to express themselves in a way which is mature, considered and well crafted. Some might say that life is all about getting what you want, and rhetoric helps with that. So you'll see within that paragraph that I've used a number of techniques. So for example, I've used anaphora because I've repeated studying rhetoric throughout at the start of a number of sentences. So what I would like to do is pause the video now and summarise the information into 3 bullet points. Okay, what is the study of rhetoric? So a little history of rhetoric and where it comes from. So this has been going on for 2,000 years ago, and it came from the city of Athens, and they believed that a man's success and influence in ancient Athens depended on his ability to persuade other men to vote him into power. So as a result of this, small schools dedicated the teaching of rhetoric, and they became known as sophists, and they would travel from city to city teaching young men in public spaces how to speak and debate. They taught the students how to make a weak argument stronger and a strong argument weak. They believed they could use language in the written or spoken word to win any debate, even if they had no prior knowledge. But Aristotle, who's a great philosopher, criticised them. He accused them of manipulating people's emotions to persuade rather than using truth, and he became very passionate about it. In fact, he wrote a book called The Art of Rhetoric. This book became a guide on persuasion. It taught people how they could manipulate language and words to get what they wanted. In fact, The Art of Rhetoric, sorry, I've just flipped forward. In fact, The Art of Rhetoric is what the study of language and study of persuasion is now based on. And he introduced 3 concepts. Logos, which is the logic or reason. Your writing must be logically structured and contain factual information. Pathos, it's got to appeal to the emotions and values of your audience. It's got to make them feel a particular emotion. And it's got to be credible using ethos. Your writing must present you as an expert on the topic with similar beliefs to your audience. This is not a new topic. This is something we've already been looking at, and in fact this week we've looked at rhetoric in Macbeth. We've looked at how Lady Macbeth manipulates Macbeth into committing murder. So have a look at this speech and identify where she uses rhetoric. If you can you identify the ethos, the logos and the pathos in the speech? Pause the video now and have a go at that task. Okay, so what you should have spotted is that Lady Macbeth uses pathos in her speech. She attacks Macbeth's masculinity. She questions whether he's a man because he cannot go through with Duncan's murder. So she says, what beast was it then that made you break this enterprise to me? When you durst do it, then you were man. Okay, so she attacks his masculinity, which had been incredibly emotive at the time because men really valued their masculinity. And she basically accuses him of letting him down. So she uses that rhetorical question and says, so, you know, what's caused you to lie to me? So she creates a sense of shame and guilt and anger and sadness at his actions. So she manipulates his emotions there. And she also uses ethos. It's quite logical. So she justifies why she's able to criticise Macbeth. She presents herself as strong as Macbeth. So therefore he trusts her. So she's like, you know, I wouldn't have lied to. I wouldn't have done that. I'm the sort of person who's breastfed a baby, but I would have killed that baby before lying to you, before I would have backed out on this. So he respects that masculinity in her because that's something he values. So rhetoric is something that you have covered in Shakespeare. It's not something new. You're used to looking at that. Okay, so I'm going to look at 3 adverts, and for each advert I would like you to pause the video and complete the sentences. Do they use ethos, logos or pathos? Pause the video now. Does this advert use ethos, logos, pathos? Pause the video now and complete the sentence. And finally, this advert, does it use ethos, pathos or logos? Complete the sentence now, pause the video. You may be familiar with this speech. It's one of the most famous speeches ever delivered, and it was John F. Kennedy, who was a former American president and often considered one of the greatest American presidents, and he delivered a speech, "We choose to go to the moon," in 1962, which now is quite logical. You know, we've gone to the moon, we've gone into space, we've currently got the rover on Mars. It's not something unusual. However, at that time in 1962 it would have sounded quite ridiculous, and he persuaded his people, the American people, to get behind the Apollo space program, which was the national effort to land a man on the moon. So he used rhetoric really effectively to persuade a whole nation to do that. So what I would like to do is I would like to pause the video and read the extract from this persuasive speech and answer the following question. How does John F. Kennedy use rhetoric in his speech? Pause the video now. Okay, so what did JFK use? What techniques did he use? He used a number of things, but he used logos, so he used facts to explain the science behind what he's trying to achieve. It is very logical, it is very credible. It can show how this challenge can be achieved. It shows that they've thought about this. It makes perfect sense. But he also uses pathos. He appeals to the emotion of the American people. You know, well, space is there and we're going to climb it, and the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there, and therefore as we set sail we have God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. He made the audience feel really excited to be embarking on this journey with him. It creates a sense of patriotism. He wants the American people to feel proud and that they're involved in that. So he uses quite a number of techniques, but those are just 2. So how are you going to create ethos, logos and pathos in your speeches? You may choose, you don't have to use them all, you may choose to use anecdotes, statistics, opinion, imperatives, rhetorical questions, triplets, direct address, hyperbole, emotive language, maxims, anaphora, and analogies. So these rhetorical methods are not a checklist and should not be treated as such. Don't try to get them all in, but those are just some of the ones that you'll be looking for, that I will be looking for when I mark your work. So we're going to have a look at an example question. Cars are noisy, dirty, smelly and downright dangerous. They should be banned from all towns and cities, allowing people to walk and cycle in peace. So you'll always be given a statement for this question and you should use that in your answer. Make sure you respond to it. If the statement is the reason you are writing your response, don't ignore it. It then goes on to say, write a letter to the Minister for Transport arguing your point of view on the statement. It will tell you the form your writing will take, in this case, writing a letter, so you should follow the conventions of a letter. So, dear Sir, comma, dear Mrs Murray, comma, dear Minister for Transport, comma. Okay, and you'll also be told who you're writing it to, and this will dictate how you write. So this one is going to a minister, so it needs to be formal in style. Most of them will need to be formal in style unless it's a speech, so pay attention to your audience. So what should a good opening look like? So I'd like you to pause the video now and read this extract. This is my example. So a good opening should make your point of view on the statement very clear. It should establish the tone of your writing. You should be creative. Don't just list the reasons as to why something should or should not happen. Take your time. Also, what any good piece of writing does is make sure you use a range of vocabulary and punctuation. What do you want your reader to feel, and how are you going to make them feel it through the language and structure you use? You shouldn't write something like, I agree with the statement. Don't get confused with paper 1, question 4. So what techniques have I used in my opening? Can you identify the following rhetorical methods that I've used? Pause the video now and have a go at that. Okay, so I use anecdote. I reference taking children to school. I've used that little story as most people will be aware of how chaotic that is in the morning, but I've personalised it by describing my morning. I've exaggerated, used hyperbole. I don't have 5 children, I have 2, and I don't live in London, but I've manipulated my personal experience to the context of the letter. I've used emotive language. So words like ungrateful little mouths to show, you know, how stressful it is in the morning. I've used triplets. I addressed the minister directly. I included rhetorical questions to encourage him to consider his response. And I've exaggerated. I don't catapult my children into the car. I don't wrestle my son into the car seat, but I've exaggerated to emphasise my perspective. Okay, so this is my full response. So pause the video now and have a read and think about what makes my answer successful. Okay, so your task is going to be this one. Remote learning has no value and should be abolished. Write an article for a broadsheet newspaper stating your opinion on this statement. And the task that I've set on Wednesday, the 3rd of March, is to research this topic. Okay, so you need to decide what your opinion is and you need to research this topic. If you go into the assignments tab on Teams, you will see this there with the 4 links to different articles that you might want to use, okay, to support your ideas. And what I've asked you to do is to come up with 5 strong arguments to support your viewpoint, not both sides, one viewpoint. So for example, I might say it should be abolished because 25% of students don't log on to lessons at all due to social and economic poverty. Then I would need a further 4 statements to support my viewpoint. Okay, so 5 solid arguments to support my viewpoint. Okay, once you've done that, I will in class during lesson, I'll have modelled this, I'll have handwritten it, but here I have typed up my version. Okay, so I've typed up my version of a model response to this. I've got a headline, I've got a subheading, and I've used a number of rhetorical techniques. I've used rhetoric throughout. So you should pause this video now and have a read of my example and think about what techniques I have employed. Okay, so there's two ways that you can go about planning this. This is a chunking grid, and a chunking grid you will see on the left hand side parts of my article, and this will help you plan your article. Okay, so within the boxes you can try and mimic what I have done. This is not your whole article, this is a plan. Okay, so in box 1 I've said give your speech, that should say give your article a suitable title and subheading. Okay, so give your article a suitable title and subheading. I used home time means home time. What are you going to use? I've used, just like Brexit, we need to take a hard line with remote learning and vote to leave it in the past. What's your subheading going to be? So for each section you should plan out what you might include in yours. If you do these, this will make sure that you've got a range of devices. So paragraph 1, it's going to ask for an anecdote. Paragraph 2, it's going to ask for a statistic. Paragraph 3, use imperatives. Paragraph 4, use a rhetorical device of your choice. So use that to plan your response. Okay, so when you come to write about it, do you need more structure? If you do, you can follow this. You may not be able to follow it all exactly, okay, but it is there for you. So for example, it tells you how to start your sentence. So for example, explain the answer to the rhetorical question using a list with colon and commas. So do you think remote learning is the best way to learn? Question mark. No. Yeah, put a colon and then answer it and explain why. Okay, so you can look at my example for how that's done. You may not be able to use them all, but it will give you a little bit of structure. And I know that set 1 and set 2 have used this before. Okay, so now you need to go off and you need to complete this response, and you have until the end of Monday to complete it before you return to school on Tuesday.